So we've been talking about the Cold War, that decades-long standoff between the Soviet Union and the United States after World War II. And so far we've been focusing on the tension between these two superpowers, but in this video we're going to consider the political and economic ramifications of the Cold War. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. So as you'll no doubt remember if you've been with me in these last few Unit 9 videos, much of what was happening in Western Europe during the Cold War was intimately tied to the policies of the United States. So essentially, because the United States exerted a profound amount of military, economic, and political influence in the West, it was the US calling many of the shots. And one of the big moves the US made during this time was the establishment of NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Because the big bad Soviets were always threatening to expand into the West, NATO was a military defense pact that many Western European nations signed with the United States. The idea was if any one state was attacked, then they were, in essence, all attacked and would therefore all respond. Now another big move was economic in nature, and it included the establishment of two entities. First was the World Bank, which was established in 1944 in order to provide loans to countries that needed to rebuild after the war. Now, later in the century, the World Bank shifted its focus to make loans to developing nations, but regardless, the goal of the World Bank was to make sure that a global economic catastrophe like the Great Depression didn't happen again. And also in 1944, the International Monetary Fund was established, which facilitated international currency exchange and encouraged global trade. And speaking of global trade, in 1995, the World Trade Organization was created, and this entity was responsible for generating and enforcing a set of rules that govern international trade. And the idea here is the same as the organization it replaced, namely the GATT, or the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Both organizations, among other things, aim to reduce tariffs between member nations so that trade can flow as freely as possible between them. Okay, so that's basically what was going on in the West during the 20th century. And though there was plenty to complain about with the organizations that I just mentioned, politically and economically, the West was doing pretty well. But in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, it was a different story altogether. Countries east of the Iron Curtain, known as the Soviet bloc, came under the military, political, and economic domination of the Soviet Union. Their answer to the IMF and the World Bank and the Marshall Plan was the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. And the goal of this organization was to bind Soviet states into a mutually reinforcing economic system which would make them all dependent on the Soviet Union. Their answer to NATO was the Warsaw Pact, which was a military alliance with the satellite states of the Soviet Union, which again would require dependence on the Soviet Union in those places. Now, so far it just sounds like we have similar situations in the East and the West. In the West, the United States led to the creation of many of the organizations that I mentioned before, and in a lot of ways, membership in those organizations and treaties made Western Europe dependent on the United States. And that's essentially what's happening in the East as well, except with the Soviet Union. But here's where the comparison starts to crumble. Soviet bloc nations did not, I repeat, did not flourish economically like Western Europe did, and this was largely because of the Soviet economic model of planned economies. Now, not every state in the Soviet bloc was communist, but they all had planned economies, and here's what that means. The economic output of these satellite states were planned by a committee within the Soviet Union. This meant that each state was told what to produce, how much of it to produce, and where they could sell it. So in that way, states in the Soviet bloc did not produce for their own benefit, but rather for the overall benefit of the Soviet Union, often to their own hurt. And in the Stalin era, these planned economies had some disastrous effects. He implemented a series of 5-year plans whose goals were the rapid industrialization of the Soviet Union and economic flourishing. And while some of these plans might be considered successful, they came at a heavy cost to Soviet citizens. For example, one of Stalin's 5-year plans emphasized the collectivization of agriculture, and this was implemented in the Soviet bloc states. In Ukraine, many farmers rebelled against the collectivization, and as a result, they got blacklisted for Soviet food distribution. And as a result, something like 5 million people died of starvation. Now, in addition to planned economies, the Soviet Union, led by the dictates of communism, extended social welfare benefits to its citizens. The state provided for many of the needs of the people, including housing and healthcare. But these state-run services were often poorly implemented. State-sponsored housing, for example, included hastily built apartment complexes which were shoddily constructed and at times required more than one family to live in a single small apartment. The Soviets also provided universal education to children, even if it did include a healthy dose of communist indoctrination. Now, in order to achieve this level of centralization, the Soviet Union systematically removed civil liberties and individual rights of the population. To that end, Stalin created huge networks of secret police both in the Soviet Union proper and in the Soviet bloc. Because how are you gonna be a ruthless, non-accommodating dictator without a robust secret police? Can't do it. Can't do it. Anyway, they were responsible for rooting out those who dissented from the Communist Party's agenda, and in order to make those threats stick, the secret police were authorized to use violence and subversion to keep the populations in check. But hey, if anyone got a little grumpy about living in a planned economy where their rights were systematically suppressed, they could just get up and move to the West, right? No. Emigration from the Soviet Union was severely restricted, and it's not hard to understand why. Communism was supposed to be the fulfillment of all of humanity's dreams, and so if everyone is miserable and fleeing to the West, it's not the best PR. Anyway, one of the best illustrations of the restriction on emigration was the construction of the Berlin Wall. So many Eastern Berliners were fleeing to the democratic West Berlin, where the economy and individual liberties flourished. So Stalin went ahead and built a massive wall to prevent East Berliners from fleeing to that filthy democratic West. Now, most of the policies I just mentioned remained in place until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. However, after Stalin died, things did get a little better under his successor Nikita Khrushchev. In 1956, when Khrushchev came to power, he publicly denounced Stalin for the authoritarian turd that he was and began a process of de-Stalinization in the Soviet Union. Under these policies, more freedom was granted to artists who, under Stalin, were forced to produce art that only glorified the Soviet Union. Khrushchev released many of Stalin's political prisoners and scaled back the secret police. He also implemented some economic policies that helped average Soviet citizens, like a 40-hour work week and allowing for more freedom for people to choose their careers. Now, part of this de-Stalinization program was to ease the heavy Soviet influence in the Soviet bloc states. Khrushchev made it clear that more civil liberties would be tolerated in these satellite states and that some limited free trade would also be implemented. And when the people of those countries heard this, they were like, oh, heck yes. But unfortunately for Khrushchev, the Soviet economy entered a severe recession from 1953 to 1964, and that meant that none of Khrushchev's promised economic reforms became much of a reality. So in some of the Soviet bloc nations who, initially got excited at the prospect of retreating Soviet influence, as the economy began to flag, they found it more and more difficult to tolerate Soviet policies of repression in their countries. And that led to some significant revolts in the Soviet bloc, and I'll tell you about two. First was the Hungarian Revolution that occurred in 1956. A reform-minded leader named Imre Nagy demanded that Hungary have free and open elections unhindered by Soviet influence, and more to the point, Hungarian independence. Now, it's important to remember that Nagy was himself a communist and never abandoned his ideals, but by this point, Soviet oppression in Hungary was so profound and stifling that Nagy, along with thousands of protesters, believed that this was the best way forward for Hungary's future. And so, upon announcing that Hungary would leave the Warsaw Pact and seek the protection of the United Nations, the Soviets sent troops to Budapest, killing almost 3,000 and crushing the revolution. And as a result, the Soviet grip on Hungary grew tighter and more oppressive. The second was the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. And here, another reform-minded leader was elected, still a communist, just a reform-minded communist. And he enacted many liberal reforms that were way outside the bounds of Soviet policy. So as a result, Warsaw Pact troops invaded Czechoslovakia, stopped the reforms, and strengthened the more oppressive wing of the Communist Party there. There were also peaceful revolutions that mainly occurred in 1989. And the impetus for these revolutions came as a result of Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev's announcement in that year that the Soviet Union would no longer intervene militarily in the Soviet bloc to support the communist governments there. And with those strictures removed, Hungary, for example, instituted the Western economic reforms it had been trying to put in place since the revolution of 1956. However, this time those reforms went unopposed by the Soviet Union. And so in 1990, Hungarians elected a government committed to democracy and free market economics. And by 1991, Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika, which introduced more openness and some limited free market economics into the Soviet Union, ultimately led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And with the earlier Soviet oppression lifted, many of the Soviet bloc states experienced a surge in nationalism and broke free, ultimately completing the process of dismantling the Soviet Union. Alright, click here to keep reviewing for Unit 9 of AP European History. And click here to grab my AP Euro Review Pack, which has everything you need to get an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.